Paul's attitude to slavery. Two New Testament texts in particular have been considered critical to an understanding of Paul's teaching concerning slavery. 1 Corinthians 7:21 and Philemon 15-16. 1 Corinthians 7:21 in the New English Translation reads thus, quote, "Were you called as a slave? Do not worry about it. But if indeed you are able to be free, make the most of the opportunity." End quote. Scholarship has long been divided on the question of whether or not Paul is saying slaves should seek any opportunity to be free. In 1995, Richard Oster wrote, quote, "Scholarship has not been able to reach a consensus about the intent of Paul's thought." End quote. Even as recently as 2002, the issue was described as still open by John Byron, who commented, quote, "Debate surrounding this passage is still not settled." End quote. The passage contains various lexical and grammatical features which render interpretation extremely difficult, to the extent that some commentators simply conclude it is ambiguous in meaning. Nevertheless, as early as the 4th century, the Archbishop John Chrysostom was aware that this passage was being understood by some Christians to say Paul was encouraging slaves to take any opportunity to be free. He wrote, quote, "Some say the words 'use it rather' are spoken with regard to liberty, interpreting it, 'If thou canst become free, become free.'" End quote. Still, it must be recognized Chrysostom himself disagreed with this interpretation. Nevertheless, this view, though still disputed, has strong support within current scholarship and is coherent with the interpretation and actions of the earliest Christians. Paul J. Achtemeier interprets Paul as saying, quote, "The Christian slave ought to take advantage of freedom if it is offered." End quote. Likewise, Richard Horsley writes, quote, "Lexical and syntactical considerations require the 'choose freedom' reading." End quote. The challenges of interpreting Paul's words in Philemon are different. In this case, the text indicates clearly that Onesimus was a slave to a fellow Christian, Philemon, and that Paul wishes Onesimus to return to Philemon, who Paul commands to be generous and considerate in his reception of Onesimus back into the household. The question the passage raises is whether or not Paul wishes Philemon to liberate Onesimus by freeing him on his return so that he is no longer a slave. In the New English Translation, Philemon 15-16 reads thus, quote, "For perhaps it was for this reason that he was separated from you a little while, so that you would have him back eternally, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a dear brother. He is especially so to me, and even more so to you now, both humanly speaking and in the Lord." End quote. The disputed phrase is in verse 16, quote, "no longer as a slave." End quote. Does this mean Philemon is to set Onesimus free, or does it simply mean that Philemon is to treat Onesimus as, quote, "more than just a slave, though still a slave," end quote, since Onesimus has been taught the gospel and been baptized by Paul and is now Philemon's brother in Christ? James Dunn wrote, quote, "A literal reading would suggest that he wanted Philemon to free Onesimus," end quote, citing several other scholars in support. Nevertheless, he also acknowledged, quote, "But it is just as possible to read the request as a plea for a transformed relationship between master and slave, still between master and slave, but transformed by the faith they shared in common." End quote. However, a neglected question which naturally arises from the text is why Paul is returning Onesimus to Philemon in the first place. Under the law of Moses, which was a significant influence on Paul's thought even after he was baptized into Christ, a servant who fled from their master was not to be returned to them. They had gained their freedom, and they were now completely at liberty to live wherever they pleased. Paul's actions, therefore, appear not only in contravention with the law of Moses, but also in contravention with the idea that in 1 Corinthians 7:21, he had told slaves to take any opportunity to gain their freedom. This apparent difficulty is resolved when the text is examined with greater care. Several factors are critical to understanding why Paul is returning Onesimus to Philemon. 1. Onesimus deliberately went to Paul when he left Philemon, indicating he knew Paul personally, knew where to find him, and trusted him to act in Onesimus' best interests. 2. At the time that Onesimus found him, Paul was imprisoned. Consequently, he was in no position to coerce Onesimus into any action with which Onesimus disagreed. 3. Paul is compelled to make an argument to convince Philemon to receive Onesimus back. 4. Paul entrusts to Onesimus the letter he writes to Philemon, relying on Onesimus to deliver the letter faithfully. These facts demonstrate that the situation between Onesimus and Philemon was not the typical situation of a runaway slave who wished to escape his master and an oppressive master who wished to recapture his slave. In fact, the situation was the reverse. The fact that Paul needed to convince Philemon to accept Onesimus indicates that Philemon did not want him back. The fact that Onesimus was willing to take a letter to Philemon, requesting that he be readmitted to the household, indicates Onesimus wanted to go back. This is not at all what we would normally expect. We must remember that Paul was imprisoned and Onesimus was at liberty. So Onesimus' actions are clearly being taken by his own volition, in his own interests, without any compulsion. If Onesimus did not wish to return to Philemon, he would not be going back to him with a letter asking Philemon to take him back. Paul had no way to force him to do this against his will. Although it could be argued that Onesimus was illiterate, could not read what Paul wrote, and was therefore returning to Philemon completely unsuspecting that Paul was returning him to Philemon's service, this would not explain why Onesimus, if he really wished to escape Philemon, would be so willing to return to his master. Further light is shed on the passage by verse 18. Quote, "Now if he has defrauded you of anything, or owes you anything, charge what he owes to me." End quote. This is often understood as referring to Onesimus having stolen from Philemon, which is then given as the reason for his flight. However, the word translated defrauded here is far more general in meaning and speaks broadly of any kind of wrong or injury. Edward Loser notes, quote, "When Paul says this, he does not necessarily imply that the slave, in running away, had pilfered something from his master." End quote. More important is the word ophele, translated owes. Standard professional lexicons define this as referring specifically to a financial debt owed by one person to another. The Greek-English lexicon by Gingrich, Arndt, Danker, and Bauer, commonly known as BDAG, defines this word as, quote, "to be indebted to someone in a financial sense, owe something to someone, be indebted to," end quote, citing a range of historical texts as evidence. Paul uses this word in verse 18, quote, "If he owes you anything, charge what he owes to me," end quote. This is not language which is natural to use of a chattel slave, for chattel slaves did not owe their master any money, nor could they. If Paul had been speaking of money which Onesimus had stolen from Philemon, he would not have used this language, for this speaks of a financial obligation which has been incurred by borrowing, not by theft. If Paul was speaking of a theft by Onesimus, he would use the language of money misappropriated and would speak in legal terms of recompensing Philemon or restoring what had been taken. But this word that Paul uses is used elsewhere in the New Testament in both verb and noun form, most commonly to speak of money owed by a debtor to his creditor, as in Matthew 18:28, Luke 7:41, and 16:5 and 7. Another important fact to take into consideration is that Onesimus left Philemon and travelled independently to Paul. Whether Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea, Greece, or in far-off Rome, all of which are possibilities at this time of his life, this would still require Onesimus to take a lengthy and expensive trip by himself from a city in Asia Minor, most likely Colossae, since Onesimus, Archippus, and Epaphras are all mentioned both in the letter to Philemon and in the letter to Colossians. If Philemon was a runaway chattel slave, such a journey would have been virtually impossible to make, not least because he would not have had the money. We could speculate that he stole that money from Philemon, but of course that would simply be an ad hoc argument. Even more importantly, if Onesimus was a chattel slave, he would be readily identified as such, most likely by a brand, tattoo, or metal collar which marked him as the property of his master. A runaway slave, so clearly identifiable, travelling alone, would scarcely be able to leave a city before being caught, let alone take a journey requiring at least one voyage by ship, and would have no way to identify themselves to soldiers in order to seek an audience with a prisoner of the state, such as Paul. The view that Onesimus was a runaway chattel slave fleeing a master he had robbed, or who had mistreated him physically, does not make sense of the available facts. It does not make sense of why Onesimus wished to return, most unlikely for a chattel slave who had been mistreated, and does not make sense of why Philemon did not want him back, most unlikely for a master whose slave had escaped and who does want him back. It also does not explain why Paul thought Onesimus was likely to be in debt to Philemon, impossible for a chattel slave, nor does it explain how Onesimus could have made a lengthy and expensive journey without being identified as a runaway slave and returned to Philemon by force or simply executed. What does make sense is that Onesimus was originally a free man, but had sold himself into debt bondage to Philemon to repay money he owed, and then later fled from Philemon's service before he had repaid his debt. Instead of being a chattel slave, he was a debt bondservant, so he was not branded or marked or collared as a chattel slave would be. This would explain why he could make a journey by himself without being identified as a runaway slave. This would also explain why Paul speaks of the possibility of Onesimus still owing money to Philemon and Paul offering to pay it, which would also strengthen the reading that Paul is telling Philemon to set Onesimus free, since his debt would now be paid. It also provides an explanation for Onesimus wishing to return. Although previously he had decided to abandon his bond service, having met Paul and been converted, he now wished to return to Philemon and fulfill his contract so he could be restored to his original standing as a free man in the community with his reputation intact. Philemon's complete lack of interest in wanting Onesimus to return is also explained by this interpretation. When Onesimus had fled, Philemon just wrote him off as a bad debt and was no longer interested in taking him back, perhaps considering him unreliable. This is certainly borne out by the idea that Philemon, according to Paul, felt that Onesimus was, to use Paul's word, unprofitable. In contrast, if Onesimus had been a chattel slave and somehow managed to owe Philemon money, then Philemon would have been very motivated to take him back so that he could sell him to another master and thus recover the money owed to him. One of the most comprehensive recent surveys of 1 Corinthians 7:21 and Philemon 14-15 and the scholarly literature on them is the 200-page study by James Harrell. Although this was written in 1995, quite some time ago now, it still remains one of the most comprehensive literature surveys. Harrell concludes that in both 1 Corinthians 7:21 and Philemon 14-15, Paul wrote in favor of an ethic of manumission, that is, setting slaves free, and that this is reflected in the early Christian tradition of freeing slaves. Harrell writes, quote, "The thesis is that neither passage supports the hypothesis, which many scholars in New Testament studies currently hold, that there was early Christian opposition to the liberation of baptized slaves. In fact, the evidence suggests that manumission was of considerable importance in the economic and social affairs of early Christian congregations. Paul allowed for manumission as an exception to his general rule that each should remain in the state in which he or she received the Christian call." End quote. This conclusion is further supported by Paul's words in 1 Timothy 1:10, in which he says that enslavers cannot enter the kingdom of God. The Greek word he uses here is andrapodistes, sometimes translated kidnapper, slave dealer, or slave trader. Professional lexicons identify this as an all-encompassing word for a person who enslaves others by force for any reason, including those who are enslaved as a result of capture in war. Consequently, in 1 Timothy 1:10, Paul is comprehensively condemning the coercive enslavement of a human being under any circumstances whatsoever. It is worth noting that this passage completely forbids the chattel slavery of the transatlantic slave trade, which would have been impossible if Paul's stricture had been obeyed.